Hello again, boys and girls. Grandpa Pheardom here. We're going to start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, Chapter 1. This is the second book we're reading in the Narnia series. This is the first one that was written, but chronologically speaking, it's the second book in the series. We finished The Magician's Nephew, and that leads us to this book. C.S. Lewis wrote, "To Lucy Barfield, my dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again, and you can take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather, C.S. Lewis." The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Chapter 1. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived there in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into our story much. Grandpa Pheardom's going to interrupt here. I don't think they actually come into the book at all after this, so that's kind of funny. Anyway, he himself was a very old man with a shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as onto his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the very first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending that he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains when we came along? And the woods? And there might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out the window you could see neither the mountains nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in a room he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so, and in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books. "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that is how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected that they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And then there was 3 steps down, 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall, and a door that led out into a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books. Most of them were very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was all quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort of thing that has a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead bluebottle fly on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt mostly sure it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. We got a picture here. We're going to try to show it. Not much of a picture, but it's the room with the wardrobe in it. Looks like there's a fireplace over there. I don't think that's supposed to be cobwebs in the corner. I think it's just supposed to be shading. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it was very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark. In there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel the woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. "I wonder if that's more mothballs," she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand, but instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor in the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went into on a step or 2 further. Next moment she found that what she was rubbing up against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough, even prickly. "Why, it's just like the branches of a tree!" exclaimed Lucy, and then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away, where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at nighttime, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had all set out. She had, of course, left the door open, as she knew that it was a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. "I can always get back if anything goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood toward the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it, and found that it was a lamp post. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of the wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. We got another little picture here. And I think we know everything about that lamppost. How we get this? It's a lamppost missing an arm at the top. And she heard the pitter-patter of feet. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees and into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upward he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like that of a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black. Instead of feet, he had goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over one arm that held the umbrella, so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short, pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella, and the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a faun. And when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all of his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the faun. And thus ends Chapter 1 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Fair winds and following seas. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye.